Doctor, are you still on the oath? Is Galloway? Yes.
I'd like to just clarify
Yes, of course you may.
points from yesterday.
Can you do it whilst she's cross-examining, or do you want to do it right at the beginning?
Well, I think there were questions that came up yesterday which I wondered whether I could just...
please do.
Two of them of a scientific nature, and one is a question you asked me, which I just wanted to be clear on. The first is Advocate Galloway asked me about she was asking about the rings under the eyes, which is a scientific question that interested me. So, and I don't know whether it has any bearing on the case, but I did again a standard evidence-based medicine search in the National Library of Medicine, and interestingly could find not a single study that has assessed the association between so-called dark rings under the eyes and sleep deprivation. So in a scientific sense, although it's commonly said by people, interestingly there's no study that's been done. So it's one of those we don't have an answer on, because there's all you have to say is there's no scientific evidence thereof. But it's an interesting study that still needs to be done. Yeah. So I think that was the first point. The second was...
And sorry, in this case, I mean, this case involved the death of his family. The trauma of that, would that not cause him to...
No. I think Advocate Galloway asked the question whether the dark rings under his eyes was a sign that he'd been sleep deprived for more than one night. And so, just to be clear, I can't answer that. I was unable to answer it yesterday, and I'm still unable to give you a scientific answer other than to say there is no scientific study that I could find to address that question. The second is that you asked the question about how commonly I see people who have a seizure and have amnesia for a period of about 2 hours, 40 minutes. And my answer to you, I think the previous day was that I see it weekly, and I think yesterday I said to you I've seen hundreds of patients with that. I think that's correct. On the stand here I did some quick mental arithmetic, but I thought more carefully about it last night. So I want to draw the distinction between those patients that we've had in the ward where we've observed this on video EEG. And so seeing this weekly over a period, I've been doing this since 1996, looking at video EEG. So you work it out at 50 let's say 50 a year on average, just roughly over 20 years, you're looking at about 1,000 or thereabouts. The history, so the majority of people I see are outpatients. So and I've seen more than 20,000 people with epilepsy, and I can't give you a number there, but the history reported by patients or their families of amnesia spanning that sort of time is common. So you can take the number that I've given you, and I don't know whether you double it or multiply it by a few, but just to make the point that it is common that people have periictal amnesia for several hours. The third point was
Is it limited to a few hours?
Oh, occasionally it can be the patient, the patient, and what they'll say to me is, sometimes patients will end up, as the nurse is putting it, sleeping for the day. So we have seen people who will have a seizure, and this is also reported by patients, is that sometimes they'll have a seizure in the morning and they wake up the next morning. So it can be for prolonged periods. Yeah, that's correct. In fact, this last weekend we had someone, admittedly she had multiple seizures. So it's taken her more than a day, and she's still not quite, well, she's still completely incoherent. She doesn't know my name, for instance, several days later. The third point was, again, a question of the scientific evidence that you raised.
Your name is easy to remember.
Yeah, sometimes you...
Think of food.
Thanks, Your Honour. The third question was just being scientifically curious. I went and looked further at the issue of the question that we raised, I think, on the first day of the period of amnesia in the forensic literature related to homicide. So, and I've delved as far as I can, as time will permit, into the literature. The literature focuses, reports only, as I said on the first day, amnesia around the homicide. So I can't find to date, any so there is no precedent that I can see for malingering that relates to a period after the homicide. I was struck by one statement and this is an interesting article in the International Journal of Law and Psychiatry, 2009, page 281 to 287. And interestingly, right at the start of the abstract, I didn't realize that it was this common, and you obviously will know better than I do, and some of the Advocate Galloway and others. But they say here that about 1/3 of defendants in homicide cases claim amnesia during the time of their alleged act, which sounds to me incredibly common, more commonly than I would have intuitively thought. So, and this particular study involved 102 Norwegian defendants, and again, in all the cases, the amnesia straddles the homicide itself. There's no report that I can find of homicide where there's retained memory for the homicide and then amnesia for the period after that. I'll keep looking.
Yeah, but not talking just in general to what you have to say, most people would claim amnesia so as not to explain the situation after a homicide.
They claim amnesia.
They claim amnesia simply because they do not wish to deal with the details of what happened.
Yes, I understand. It's malingering. Yeah.
Malingering.
Yes. Yeah. So the point is, it was
perhaps not even malingering. Perhaps they'll try to blot out the memory of traumatic events.
Yeah. I mean, it may be that, as you correctly point out, that some of them are psychogenic, where there are coping mechanisms in the brain which do shut it out. I would agree 100% with that. And it's an interesting neuroscience question, I would think. And obviously very difficult to study, given that there's no way of studying the brain around
Two options: either neuroscience or streetwise.
Yes. Okay. But I was struck by how common it is that people have amnesia for homicide, and yet I can't find a precedent certainly in the forensic psychiatry and biomedical literature for someone with retained memory for the homicide and amnesia reported subsequently. So, maybe there is a case somewhere there that, a single case report, but obviously you can see the sort of commonality of
Dr. Butler, we want to get you back to your
I understand, thank you.
Or your rooms, whatever you call them.
Before the proceedings started, Advocate Galloway asked me to keep my answers short, so I said to her that I'll hedge my bets and say Yanya.
Dr. Butler, just before we speak of the third aspect that you raised from your evidence before, there was something that I wanted to clarify with you in that regard, the malingering with regard to the murder or the homicide itself. What is different, I must just point this out to you, what is different in the present case is the accused does not need to not remember or explain the murders. He has an explanation for that. Whether the court believes him or not, that is a different story. He has an explanation for that. What he does not have an explanation for is the subsequent 2 hours 40 time loss. And that would probably then explain why he has no malingering or memory loss for the homicide, but he does for the 2 hour 40 minutes.
Yes, I agree. So I think, all I'm saying is that I think that as I concluded it, and it's just to substantiate my conclusions, yes, that to make the point that what preceded the onset of his amnesia is beyond my sphere of competence.
Now, if I can just summarize your evidence yesterday as well. If we speak objectively, you've referred to it several times as we don't have a video recording. The only objective video recordings that we do have of the accused having epileptic seizures are the 2 seizures, myoclonic seizures, that he had whilst in your ward. And the one amounted to the twitch of his thumb, and the second one amounted to the jerking during sleep.
Correct.
Those are the only two objective versions of the accused having seizures.
Correct.
Now, excuse me. If we continue with the accused conduct and state of mind, referring to a postictal state after having then suffered a seizure on the 27th of January 2015. There is evidence on record of Dr. Van Zyl, who is a doctor at the Vergelegen Mediclinic at that time. I don't know if she's still there. She testified that on the evening of the 27th of January 2015, the accused, on his own volition, wandered into the emergency room at the hospital. He ended up with her. She examined him with regards to the injuries that he presented with. And she describes in her report that, I'm referring the witness to Exhibit 00, she described his demeanor as being confident, not emotional, conversing casually and relaxed with staff, orientated to person, place and time. The reason why I'm putting this to you, Doctor, is in contrast thereto, there was a trial within a trial regarding the manner in which the accused statement was obtained. Some evidence was laid during the trial within the trial, and similar statements or evidence was put to Dr. Van Zyl. That in fact he wasn't, as is evident from her observation, he wasn't relaxed and comfortable and casual, not emotional. He was actually very emotional when he was with his family.
You mean that evening?
That evening.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, I understand. So the one version was...
Let's interrupt a little bit, but with respect by Nicole, she's conflating two aspects. What I put to the witnesses is that, and she's quite correct to say that the accused version was, and he testified like that, he was very emotional when he left the police station, when he met up with the family again. But it was never the evidence that he was emotional when he was with Dr. Van Zyl. I just want to make that very clear. That was definitely not the evidence.
Yes,
No, I never said he was emotional.
yes, but that distinction is fine.
The distinction is that when he was with his family,
Sorry to interject, could I ask, so just to get the sequence correct here, so did he see his family first and then he saw...
he went from his family advised him to see a doctor.
Oh, I understand.
He went from seeing his family to the doctor, where he was, in all apparent from her description and the evidence in court, he did not appear emotional in the sense of crying about the incident, which is the inference that was drawn from how he would have acted when he was with his family.
Yeah, I understand.
Shortly thereafter, sorry, the accused, after he'd left Dr. Van Zyl, he was brought back by the police to the same doctor.
Right.
It appears coincidentally.
Can I just ask about the time intervals then?
If I'm not mistaken, it's not hours. It's not minutes, but it's not hours. It's hours.
So just to give me some idea, he sees the family roughly at what sort of time of the day?
In the afternoon, after 4 o'clock,
Right.
after his statement is being deposed of.
It could be 1 or 2 hours.
It is 1 or 2 hours in between the family and the doctor, and then again...
1 or 2 hours, Mr. Worthy?
It would appear that he signed the affidavit of memory service correctly at 3:30 that afternoon. He then went back to Somerset West. He saw the doctor, if I remember correctly, the first time, if memory serves me correctly, around about 1900 hours, or between 17 and 1900 hours, and he went back with the police after 2100 hours. That's how. 21:45, he went back the second time.
So it's a number of hours. It's not.
Couple of hours.
Yeah.
So from the family to the doctor, and then a few hours later back to
the doctor.
I understand. With an interval of perhaps 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I understand.
So the evidence is when he was with the family, after he'd given his statement, where the comment of the officers was also that it was unemotional.
Right.
He goes back to the family where he is emotional, very emotional apparently. And then he is seen by Dr. Van Zyl, who describes him as confident, not emotional, conversing casually. And the evidence in court was they actually had quite a nice conversation whilst he was. Then when he's returned by the police again to the same doctor, it appears coincidental. He is now withdrawn and he gives monosyllabic answers. Given that evidence, doctor, the possibility of the accused acting in a certain manner, depending on which people he is with, can that be excluded?
What it be excluded?
The fact that the accused might act in a certain manner, depending on where he finds himself, under what circumstance.
You mean as part of the postictal state?
No, in general. And maybe then a postictal state.
So, sorry, I'm missing the point, I think. So is your question that the variability of the behavior, is that within the normal range of what a normal human being would do in a state?
Not that the possibility that the accused acts in a certain demeanor or manner,
yes,
depending on where he finds himself, the circumstances, can that be excluded?
I think it's common cause that our behavior is significantly context dependent. That's all I can say. So our behavior, my behavior in court today might be quite different to the one when I go home tonight and with my family. That's all I can say, I think. I'm not sure that I'm being terribly helpful, Your Honour. And if you wish to rephrase the question, if I'm,
It's fine, thank you, Doctor. Then you've already alluded to the fact that you were given copies of Exhibit C, the photographs of the accused while in the ambulance. Now, given the injuries that you could see on the accused in those photographs,
yes,
at this point in time, there is undisputed evidence before this court of 2 doctors who testified and said that in their opinions, given the medical literature on the subject and their experience, those injuries are self-inflicted. And not self-inflicted in the sense of I was clumsy or I was disorientated and I bumped my toe or I fell down or anything. Self-inflicted, deliberately injuring yourself for whatever purpose.
Yeah, I understand.
Would the accused have been able to inflict those type of injuries in a postictal state?
I think, I would think the odds are much higher. There's a much higher likelihood that they would occur in the pre-ictal phase, when the brain is, in the pre-ictal phase when the brain is working well.
Because if one, given your evidence yesterday about perception, one
yes,
of the cognitive
exactly,
functions that fall away,
yeah.
That would have been difficult for him.
Absolutely, I think it's much, and it's also consistent with the history here that all of his other injuries, the lacerations, the stab. I didn't go into those in detail, but he was clear to me that when I saw him the first time, that he was aware of all of those before he had lost consciousness, and that the bruise to the forehead was pointed out to him subsequently by a doctor. He was unaware of that. So I think one has to say that those, whatever the nature of those injuries, and if I defer to the experts on that matter, then it's very likely they happened before the seizure. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Now, if we have regard specific to your paragraph 51, that would be on page 21 of your report, Doctor. Firstly, you mentioned in the event of an unwitnessed seizure characterized by...
Sorry, at the bottom of 51, I beg your pardon.
51.
Yeah, thank you.
The first sentence there, in the event of an unwitnessed seizure characterized, the unwitnessed seizure is, you're referring to the seizure on the 27th of January 2015? Or is this
correct.
In general?
This is in general, yeah.
In general.
So these comments that I've made here are general comments, yeah.
Okay. And then because that's what I couldn't understand, you mentioned here characterized by periictal amnesia. Does that refer to amnesia prior to the seizure? Or?
No, I think it's, so periictal means, and that's just a summary of the seizure and the postictal phase, yeah. So it's lumping the two together.
So it's not, it doesn't that, because your evidence was that the accused was quite lucid prior to the
correct,
seizure.
yeah.
So I couldn't understand the periictal term.
Yeah, you heard my uncertainty about whether, and this is the problem, if someone has a seizure like a patient of mine on Saturday morning did, and he's alone, and his first memory is 2 hours later, then I'm uncertain about how much of that is seizure and how much of it is postictal. So that is simply lumped together as peri-ictal amnesia. Peri meaning around the time of the seizure.
Yeah, because that's how I understand your evidence, doctor, is that you cannot say with any kind of certainty, firstly, how long, accepting that you suffered a seizure on that morning, how long the actual seizure was.
Correct, yeah, no, I think you're 100% right.
It could be anything between a number of seconds up until...
No, I think that's incorrect. It would have to, I mean, there are good studies about the duration of tonic-clonic seizures, and in order to have amnesia, post-ictal amnesia and loss of consciousness for hours, the seizures almost certainly gone on at least for 1 to 3 minutes, at least 1 to 3 minutes. Yeah.
That's the average length of a tonic-clonic.
That's an average length of a tonic-clonic, and and when it's a first one or someone who stopped their anti-epileptic drugs, that's when you're more at risk for longer seizures. You'll understand, because you have less protection or less artillery to protect yourself against seizures.
And because, as a result, because you can't say how long the seizure was, you can't determine how long the post-ictal state was.
Indeed.
That is what you're actually saying with
correct,
paragraph 51.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct.
But now, given the fact, doctor, that there is evidence of expert opinions of the accused presenting with self-inflicted injuries, and if the court was to accept that it is self-inflicted injuries, given that this is a criminal matter, it is more probable that the self-inflicted injuries would have occurred after the murders and not before the murders.
Yes, but before the period of
the seizure.
The seizure, yeah.
But after the murders.
I would, if that's the case, I would think that one's judgment would be that's correct, yeah.
And the actual action of inflicting self-harm, so to speak, I would presume, you would know more about a person's brain functions than I do, I would presume that you wouldn't just do it, you would have to think, there would have to be a thought process involved prior to executing the self-harm.
I guess it depends how nimble and quick thinking you are on your feet. So
if I may interrupt you, it implies an element of deception.
Yes, yeah.
So you would have to think about your circumstances, come to the decision, and then execute.
Yeah, but as you know, some people are very quick in sort of planning and strategizing. Yeah, unquestionably.
So that would have those injuries been done or inflicted after the murders, before the seizure. It would also lessen the time frame of 2 hours 40 of the seizure and or the post-ictal.
That calls for such speculation that it is virtually impossible, and I'm with all due deference to my own expert witness, for even a witness who had more information about the case to answer that question. I mean, we don't know, first of all, and your Lordship clearly definitely not made that finding yet, whether this is self-inflicted or not.
Is it?
Whether your Lordship, the court hasn't made the finding it's self-inflicted, firstly.
No, she said that it's not something the court is still finding.
If it is self-inflicted, then secondly, also assuming it happened after the murders, that we also don't know, and thirdly, that would then have impacted on the period of 2 hours and 40 minutes. That presupposes we know when the murder happened. We don't know that, as in conjunction with all the other things.
Yes, it's quite clearly speculation, but I think you can clear this up.
Indeed, the only thing that I'm trying to ascertain from the witness, my Lord, his report contains several aspects of possibilities. This is just one possibility that I'm putting to you.
He's not putting it as a fact. He's putting it as a possibility.
Just as a possibility, Doctor. It's a question of, given that your evidence is that you have no way of determining
Oh, I understand.
the time,
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean.
happened in between.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah,
You understand?
I understand. Yeah, yeah. No, I think if the let's say theoretically the record showed that, and the evidence was that the period was 2 hours 10 minutes, it makes no difference to my conclusions.
You still can't determine what happened.
No, it's just, as I've said to you before, all of the evidence that we've discussed before is of a seizure in a post-ictal state. But if that was an hour and 40 minutes or 2 hours and 40 minutes makes absolutely no difference to my conclusions.
In that instance, just to complete the picture, Doctor, that would also then be possible that the accused could have had a seizure at, say, let me put the full picture to you, Doctor. What we do know of the night of 26 to 27 January 2015 is that during the late evening hours of 26 January, that's the preceding evening, the Friday evening,
Right.
the voices of, in the opinion of the witness, people who were in an argument, quite heavy argument, was heard as from around about 10 o'clock and until 12 o'clock when she went to bed, it was still ongoing.
I understand.
That we know, that's the beginning of the timeline, like that.
Yeah.
On the accused's own evidence, coupled with a timeline of cell phone and landline data, round about 04:24 the Saturday morning, the attacks on the family was over. That was shortly after the attacks. And then at 04:27, that is when there was the last activity on specifically the accused's cell phone. That is the last activity we have, and the first activity we have on the cell phone and landline data is 07:12.
Right.
So that is where the 2 hour 40 come from.
Understand, yeah.
And what makes it difficult is up until, I'm just trying to get the dates right before I make a wrong comment to you, up until before you testified or before you came into the picture with regards to epilepsy.
Yes, I understand.
The accused's explanation for that 2 hour 40 minutes was, as testified to by Dr. Trevaux, the possibility of him having had quite a severe fall on the stairs, then subsequently returning to the stairs, seeing his mother and sister, and sort of, as it was put, a combination of the two events, the severe head, the fall on the stairs, which I presume is where he sustained the head injury, but a combination of head injury and the shock of seeing his mother and sister. That caused him to lose consciousness for 2 hours 40 minutes. Now, after you come into the picture with epilepsy, now his explanation is now I might actually have had an epileptic seizure.
Yeah. Perhaps before the witness answer that, number one, and he's borne out by my client's plea explanation, he said emphatically, I looked up and I then lost No, but she's put to the witness what my version.
He's put it wrongly because he's not saying so, the doctor is saying so.
No, but her factual statement put to the doctor, that's what I'm complaining about. It's not factually correct. It was never said, either by my client or by Dr. Trevaux, that he lost his consciousness as a result of the combination of a previous fall and thereafter. They were at pains to say, we don't know, and the doctor said,
I think
the knock is consistent with
the evidence is clear that doctor didn't know the cause of
Indeed, my Lord.
the only explanation we've ever had in this case is the explanation this doctor comes up with.
Indeed, my Lord. Just for record purposes, the accused plea explanation said, I'm not sure, but I think it's a combination of
I did say that,
And I did put it to the doctor that Dr. Trevaux testified about the possibility of that being so. So I'm, with all due respect, what I did make a mistake in is not the accused version that he's had a seizure, it's the witness version, and therefore the defense version that the accused might have had a seizure. So, sorry. So that is why the whole question of the 2 hours 40. That's where we get the 2 hours 40. And why we're trying to determine what could or could not have happened during the 2 hours 40 minutes. You understand?
Yeah.
So, if I understand you correctly, there is no way that you can determine how long the seizure was within that 2 hour 40 minutes.
Absolutely.
Or how long the postictal state.
I stand by
What
that.
do you say?
I agree. I've said that a number of times.
You can't.
I can't tell how long the seizure was and how long the postictal period was. Yeah.
So, just to complete the picture then, Doctor, having regard to his previous tonic-clonic seizures as reported to you, could it also have been possible for him to have had a seizure shortly before making the first call to the emergency people at 7:12?
I think given the severity of the evidence that we have about his post-ictal state, i.e. that he wet himself, but B, that he had neglect thereof, suggests a much more severe post-ictal delirium or encephalopathy than with the other 2 seizures. So I think it's much more likely that if you take the international, as I said before, the seizure severity scales, this clearly, I think it's common cause here that the severity of the seizure was much greater than the other ones. Okay. So I very much doubt that he had a short seizure and recovered quickly. And the reason I make that statement is, well, he wet himself, and by 8 o'clock, when they took the clothes off him, he was blissfully unaware that his pants were wet, and he was still in a state where he didn't recognize that he had this injury to his left forehead. So unquestionably, that was a much more severe. I think we would all agree, if that's an epileptic seizure, it's much more severe than the other 2.
But still within the range of 1 to 3 minutes.
Yes, it could be a seizure of 1 to 3 minutes, but then with a prolonged, severe postictal delirium.
But that itself is an assumption that there was a seizure.
Yes, no, and I did qualify that. Yeah.
Because speaking of malingering, and if the court has already remarked on the fact that if the court was to believe the accused that he was lying on the stairs, immobile, for the whole 2 hours, 40 minutes, because it could also be, given the self-inflicted injuries, it could also be that he wasn't even on the stairs when he suffered the seizure, for instance. We have only the accused as a source for that information.
You mean exactly where it happened?
Yeah. We have no other information than the accused of what he was doing at the time when he suffered the seizure. And you cannot, with scientific certainty, say how long the seizure was and how long the postictal state was.
Well,
you can infer it from your general knowledge.
Absolutely. So I think the two most important facts here in terms of the postictal state are the fact that he was incontinent and that that there was neglect. And I mean, just to make it, I probably said so 2 days ago, but neglect is not some mild dysfunction in the brain. It's severe dysfunction in the brain. You're getting the sensory information to the brain. And your pants are wet, you're drenched, your legs are wet, the skin is sending the information to the brain, and the brain is so dysfunctional that it doesn't appreciate the fact that pants are wet. And we know this from other patients who have dementias and deliriums. So we do see incontinence in those patients occasionally, but it's always in the setting of someone whose brain is significantly dysfunctional, like you do in a postictal state. And just to make one other point, is that in the instances, and this is where, this is not based on theory. So if you take patients in our ward who have epileptic seizures and who wet themselves, when and the nurses then change them or remove the clothing, and the person is unaware of it having happened, those are always severe. There's severe seizures with postictal encephalopathies. So that's not some mild process that happens in the brain that's transient. And so the fact that the pants are I think I stand under correction, but I think the pants were taken off him roughly at about 8 hours, I'm not sure. So we can infer that, you know, for that period there, including when the paramedics were there, the police were there, that he had neglect of this urinary incontinence. And he was unaware of the bruise on his forehead, despite, you know, having laid down memories earlier of what may be self-inflicted injury.
I referred you to this previously yesterday as well, Doctor. That is, if the accused is to be believed.
Understand.
You understand?
I understand your question.
I can understand from a medical point of view.
Yeah.
Like you said, if a person has incontinence of urine, it's proven otherwise.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is from a medical perspective. In
Yeah.
criminal law, the court has to, with all due respect, take into account several other aspects, not just the medical.
Well, I think I think in the medical sense as well, because you see, we have to be ever alert to the diagnosis of malingering, and so just to make the point, which I think I did on the first day, is that what struck me here, and it's in my written report, is that when I took this history from him, he initially said no, he hadn't wet his pants. So the malingerer draws attention to the fact, the significance of this is a by the by. And the neglect of it is you know, neurologically, in coming to the different.
In this
I understand.
his brother is murdered. It's a desperate state, horribly wrong.
Yeah.
Wet pants are a minor consequence of what the reaction should be, isn't it?
I would argue the contrary, Your Honour, with all due respect, and I would happily at the next neurology conference take the scenario.
Yes, you can't argue to the contrary.
Yeah.
But all I'm saying is that the wet pants is a minor inconsequential detail in the background of what happened there.
I would argue that the incontinence, as I've said in my report, is of profound significance in this case, and I stand by that.
Because, Doctor, and I know it's not really that you're a medical expert and an expert in epilepsy and the symptoms thereof, but the possibility of, given what the accused case or the defense case was up until now in explaining the 2 hours 40, and now he rather fortuitously is diagnosed with epilepsy. So, because don't understand us wrong, we accept that he's now been diagnosed with epilepsy.
Yes, now I get that. Yeah.
So it is not that far or that impossible that the accused could go, oh, but hang on. Now I have an explanation for the 2 hours 40.
I understand that, and that's why, as I said right at the beginning, it's a question here of one doesn't sum probabilities, you multiply probabilities, as you know. So, in coming to my conclusions, the issue is not simply based on the incontinence alone. So, you have to multiply the probabilities of the totality of the evidence. So, there's the incontinence, there's the neglect, there's the issue of the amnesia, which I've referred to, which seems to me, you know, if it is the case that the amnesia is after the homicide, it's almost precedent-setting in the world and unheard of. So, when I, at the end of when I came to my conclusions, in a sense, in an evidence-based medicine, is you taking all the bits of data and the probabilities of those, and you multiplying them, and that's where you end up with a very strong probability. So, notwithstanding my biases, which I articulated at the beginning of this trial, the evidence was so overwhelming that I was forced to come to a contrary conclusion and disregard my initial biases, and that's why I did so. It's not the incontinence on its own.
It's the neglect there as well.
No, it's the multiplicity of probabilities which I have enumerated in my report, and added to that the evidence that I presented earlier and that I showed you this morning of there is amnesia after the homicide, not before. So, you know, if there are, let's just say conservatively, I mean, here's one study of 100 people, but let's say there are 1,000 people reported in the literature of the amnesia around the time of the homicide and none after the homicide, then you're betting, you're going down to Ladbrokes and you're saying, well, you're taking 1,000 to 1 bet.
I've already put to you the possibility of why that could be different in practice than in literature.
I understand, yeah.
So, moving on to the aspect of the neglect, Doctor. The wetting of the plants, the accused had access to, and if my memory serves me correctly, he had studied or read through the docket, the police docket, before the commencement of the trial. The trial commenced at the end of April. Obviously, he had to see what the evidence was so that he can instruct his counsel. Part of the police docket is a 2-lever arch file, or 1.5 lever arch file, a very voluminous statement by a bloodstain analyst, Captain Hubert. I am referring the witness to exhibits triple D, my lord. I think it's 1 up until 4 or 5.
Yes, remind us what that is.
Sorry, my lord?
Which file was that?
That is separate files, my lord. If I'm not mistaken, the brown-backed files.
Okay.
Captain Hubert's files. That is where the photograph that was given to you of the urine stained pants also comes from. Captain Hubert obviously considered or remarked upon the urine stains on the pants. It was part of his written report as well as the photographic attachments to his report. Captain Hubert also testified during the course of the trial, and he repeated his observations and remarks with regards to the urine on the pants. So it is not as if the accused had forgotten about the urine stains as from the time of the incident until when he was with you in consultation.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, but hang on, somebody told me that I'd actually read it. He was well aware of that evidence in the police document.
He was, and he answered instinctively to say no, and then on reflection remembered that the police had told him that he'd wet his pants. You understand? So, and as I said yesterday, one struck by the malingering. So he has an event in February 2016. The malingerer at that point, when with a blackout, would then, and with a family member, would say, well, I've got to draw attention to this because this can get me out of jail. Right? Let's be frank. So there's no evidence for 2 years, and I don't know when it was in February, so that's 2 years and 9 months or something since the homicide. There's no attention to draw attention to this, whereas malingerers use medical information powerfully in assisting them for their secondary gain.
Sorry to interrupt, but that is why malingering is a medical condition.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it appears to doctors, yeah. In fact, it appears in, I think it appears in DSM-5 under the psychiatric conditions.
My lord, I'm almost done. Maybe we can...
Right. Yeah.
My lord, yeah, I haven't got much more.
Okay.
Doctor, now,
Doctor, are you qualified to comment on the psychiatric bits?
No, I would defer to any psychiatrist. The field of epilepsy, interestingly, is one which requires considerable psychiatric skills, because we see lots of patients with mood disorders. About 40 to 50% of patients with seizures have comorbid epilepsy, have comorbid anxiety and depression, and we see a lot of psychosis. So part of this confused brain, postictally, is I not infrequently in my ward have people who, when you use the term postictal delirium, some of them are frankly psychotic. So in this state they may assault nurses who try and restrain them from leaving the hospital. They see things, they hear things. So the brain is really in a bad way, and I deal with that. So I use antipsychotics often. In fact, weekly I'm using antipsychotics. So I'm not trained as a psychiatrist, and I would defer to the opinions of a psychiatrist, but I see plenty of what would be called, and the field actually, psychiatry and neurology are not that far apart in a field called neuropsychiatry, actually.
Doctor, then if we move on to the urinating.
In him? No.
So if we just look at the urinating on himself, because that is, given the photograph of his pants.
Sorry, I'm sorry I must just correct myself, Your Honour. He is known with depression and anxiety for which he's on treatment. I apologize. Sorry? No, that diagnosis was made after the murder, and he, as I said right at the beginning of my report, he is on fluoxetine for anxiety and depression. So I'm sorry,
Oh, sorry, I missed that, but
yeah.
yes, you're right.
Yeah.
So if we just look at the incontinence of urine, of which there is a photograph, so there's objective evidence of that.
Yeah.
When that occurred and the reasons why that occurred, we do not have any objective record. We only have the accused say so.
Correct, yeah.
And if we look at your evidence yesterday regarding to how bladder control works, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic functions of the brain. And again, it's my 5-minute internet medical knowledge, so please tell me if I understand it incorrectly.
Sure.
As I understand, there's a part of your brain that governs your bladder. Like you said, if there's fluid coming through from the kidneys, it will collect. The bladder wall will
distend or dilate.
Yeah, but you won't just urinate on yourself randomly, because there's another part of your brain that controls that.
Yes, so you have a control center in the inside of your frontal lobes, which is where you have voluntary bladder control. So when you and I sit here or stand here in court, the system is governed subconsciously by the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic meaning it has autonomy. So that's the system which when we're stressed, allows us the bladder to dilate and the sphincter to contract and urine to accumulate. And as someone asked me at the end of proceedings yesterday or the day before, when we discussed yesterday, asked me the very good question of why when he's busy and running around all day here in the court, he doesn't notice any problems, and the moment he gets home and he sits down in his chair, he feels the urge to go. Right? The adrenaline's flowing during the day, and in fact this happened to me previously with a court case where I had to stop on the way, having been here in court all day. My sympathetic nervous system was going, and my bladder was obviously dilating, the sphincter was contracted, and I had to pull off the road halfway home because I realized no moet ek gaan.
Yeah, because you get to the point also, doctor, in certain situations or under certain conditions.
Doctor, your position will be so much worse than taking lazies.
Quite correct, Your Honor, quite correct.
So says the old man, well.
Not just the old men, old women also tend to fall into. So you also get, because of certain circumstances, you also get to a point where the information in your frontal lobe that controls your bladder control, the absent bladder control, it is so overflowed with information and emotions that you stress to follow the dictates of your control.
Well, I think it's preceded by sensory information. So you have so the reason you go to the toilet at a certain time in the day is that there's other information. So that's all autonomic nervous system. Then there's a separate system which comes to your brain and says, this thing's getting full now, you better go, right? So that's when you go. That's the voluntary control system. Yeah, so it's preceded by the great discomfort that people have when their bladder gets very full. And I can tell you, last time I left court, when that happened a few years ago, it was considerable discomfort.
But you also get to circumstances such as when you're feelings of extreme stress, that your bladder doesn't even have to be full, because your frontal lobe is so oversaturated with emotions and feelings of stress and the events that are occurring that you feel you have to go now.
No, I think it's the opposite. No, the opposite. So your sympathetic nervous system is just letting your bladder fill while you're at war with the world. You know, I mean, I'm putting it sort of evolutionarily. When you're at war or fighting war, or you know, you're running for your life, the whole thing's dilating to protect you in this situation. So it's precisely at the point at which you start to relax that the parasympathetic, then there's less sympathetic and more parasympathetic. So at that moment, the bladder wall starts to do this a bit. And if the bag is full, then the information, like the gentleman I described, or me on the way back home, the information says, now the thing is, now you really got to go. Okay, because you previously thought the bag was this full, but actually now the parasympathetic has made it a little bit smaller.
But you do get instances where people urinate on themselves because of other reasons, where their frontal lobe control
is
overridden, so to speak.
Yeah, so if in the state of, you're quite right, so if the brain is dysfunctional, like let's say you've got a severe brain injury, or you are demented and you're lying in bed and you're just lying there, the bladder fills up eventually, and the brain is working so badly that again there's neglect. The sensory information, the stuff that's getting up here, the brain just doesn't react.
And then, but what about people who urinate on themselves when they laugh too much?
That's a separate condition now. That's an interesting one you raised, and that's called stress incontinence. So that is not a problem with the nerves. That happens particularly in women, and that's a problem with the sphincter. So it's not a problem with nervous control. So there are people who, especially after hysterectomies, where and I'm not an expert on this, I'm just giving you this from as a non-expert on the problem of stress incontinence. But it's largely a problem that the gynecologists see, and it's called stress incontinence, and it's a problem with a valve at the bottom. So the little tap, as it were, is not working, and the tap is leaking. And so the moment you laugh, right, the stuff goes up, because the tap at the bottom is dysfunctional.
And what about instances where people also urinate on themselves due to extreme fright?
I think largely it will be the same thing. So people who have problems with the sphincter at the bottom will be prone to do that. Yeah.
So urinating on yourself or wetting yourself, the symptom of that act happening cannot be ascribed only to having suffered a tonic-clonic seizure. There are other instances or conditions which can also cause that.
I think undoubtedly, and that's why I made the point, I think here in my report, is it's the combination. So, and I somewhat jocular manner made the point that, you know, if your neighbor walks out of their house and they tell you they've lost consciousness and their bladder is wet, it's that combination that is so powerfully predictive.
Speaking of combination...
And in such a situation where there are multiple murders, which you may have witnessed, doesn't that increase the prospects of you wetting yourself? Or open itself to a multiplicity of other factors?
Well, I think the issue is in the sympathetic situation. If you're in that state, you're less likely to wet yourself. Right? It may be that if, as time goes by and the sympathetic drive is removed, that you then, as you go into a parasympathetic state, then you can.
It's really, in such a situation, what happens in the realm of ordinary human experience, anything happens in such a situation. It's an extraordinary situation.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, as we know, there are exceptions to everything.
You see, Doctor, it's not just the murders. There's also evidence on record of, after the murders having taken place and the emergency personnel arriving, the first responder to the scene, the person to whom the door was open, so to speak, he testified that he approached the house in a tactical manner. He explained that to the court to mean that he came with a gun drawn. So if given what the accused at that time had just gone through, now he's sort of relaxing because it's over. And then he is approached by a uniform-clad policeman with gun drawn. That would add to the stress also.
No, I think that would, at that point he would, if anything...
There was not even a suggestion from Sergeant Kleiner that when I drew the gun, he wetted himself.
Right.
First of all.
Ms. Galloway, that's overstating it.
My Lord, I'm not putting it to the witness that was the reason for the wetting. Comorbid. I'm saying that that is a combination of factors that would add to the traumatic trauma of the circumstances.
Could I, Your Honour, could I answer
I
that?
also remind my little colleague that when I put the version in his statement to him, he retracted it. He conceded that was not the case. I also remind her of that.
He did not retract the fact that he approached the house tactically.
Okay, put the question so that the answer the witness.
I will, under the circumstances.
I'm happy to answer it actually.
Yeah, answer, please do.
Yes, yes. But I think at that point, again, you'd be in sympathetic overdrive. So your bladder would go from being that position to more dilated. So you're less light, and the sphincter would contract. So the short answer is, the opposite would happen.
Then just, and I think I've already put this to, but just to summarize and make sure I understand you correctly, Doctor. If one considers the seizure in February 2016, you called it not cause the seizure, but to use this
Provoke? Or,
provoke.
Oh, yeah. Precipitate.
Yeah, precipitate.
I think you, but I understand what you mean. Yeah.
As, given that it is reported to you that the accused at that point in time was feeling stressed and or emotional about the case. He was talking about it, so
yes.
I mean it's probably obvious that he was feeling emotional or stressed.
Sure.
And in all probability it also had a lack of sleep due to his emotional state. He didn't report that to you.
I think his point was, I would just have to check my records about exactly what he said about sleep. I think he didn't remember because there'd been an interval of. Yeah, I think I stand under correction, Your Honour, but I think he said that he couldn't remember how well he'd slept the night before, is my memory of it.
And the fact that he had consumed, as was reported to you, he had consumed quite a fair amount of alcohol.
Yes, in disclosing information to me, he was very frank about it. And he said, I think his words were at least 6.
So, those circumstances, the accumulation thereof, it could have precipitated the seizure in February 2016.
Yeah. I think the other thing to say is that some seizures are precipitated and some, as the name seizure implies, many occur just out of the blue. So there isn't always a precipitant. And in fact, it's to the frustration of most patients that they can't reliably identify precipitants in order to take action to prevent them. And it's one of the big scientific questions about, if we could predict these things. Because one of the worst things for patients is this unpredictability of seizures. Yeah.
If I may just have one.
Yes.
Just one scenario possibility that I need to put to you, Doctor, is given the facts and circumstances of this case, and the history that is provided to you of when the seizure would have taken place or occurred, is it a possibility that the accused could have committed the murders, done things, and then had the seizure?
I think, as I said before, the answer is emphatically yes. As I said before, you have experts at your disposal who are far more competent and better qualified to analyze the information about what preceded what I confidently feel was a tonic-clonic seizure on the night of the murder.
And as far as you're concerned, given the history given to you again by the accused, he would have been 100% or as lucid as normally possible if he had committed the murders before the seizure?
I think highly likely, and that's why I put in a small caveat there, is that some patients can get little absences leading up to it. But, we're into the realms of speculation about whether it did or didn't happen, and I feel that, again, I don't want to wade into that.
And then there's another possibility, Doctor, is the possibility cannot be excluded that the accused could simply be fabricating everything except the fact that his pants was wet.
I think the totality of the evidence, as I said to you earlier, if you sum all the bits of the data here, and I thought very critically about this, is, and I stand by the statement, that it's highly unlikely that this sequence of events can somehow be explained by malingering. The probabilities of each point of the data points multiplied by one another is just too powerful in my view.
That is speaking as a medical expert, given medical history and medical way of examining a witness.
Unquestionably, but we have to, in all our diagnoses, and you can see malingering enters our differential diagnosis all the time. It has to. Otherwise, if we're not circumspect as a profession, then we're constantly being fooled by malingering.
Thank you, my Lord. I have no further questions.
Doctor, just a few aspects. You would recall the questions that was posed to you by my little colleague, and I think the one or two from the bench as well, pertaining to the information that you gained from the accused about the night in question, the night in murder. If I understand you correctly, could you just place on record on how many occasions did you see the accused over the weekend that he was, after he was admitted to the clinic?
Well, I saw him on the Friday night.
Yes.
Friday evening, as I said, somewhere it'll be late afternoon. I do my ward round between about 5 and 7 in the evening on a Friday night, so it would have been then. I read the
I beg your pardon, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could we take it step by step? Could I ask in your report to please go to paragraphs 8 to 40? That's where you deal with the discussion you had with him on the Friday afternoon, if it's correct.
Correct, yeah.
And could you just confirm and just go through there? Did you, at this discussion on the Friday, did you receive any information from Mr. Van Breda about the events of the 27th of January 2015? Or the night of the murder? Just if you go through that, because I couldn't find anything.
I was focused on trying to establish as quickly as possible what had happened on that Wednesday night. That was my starting point of my investigation.
Okay. And then could you then go to paragraph 12, I want to just come back a little bit later. You just read through that, just refresh your memory. Did he at this, you've read paragraph 12?
Yes.
Yeah. Did he at this first meeting, did he say anything or suggested to you in any way that his recent bout of loss of memory is somehow linked to the evening of the murder? Did he say anything about that to you?
Not at all.
Then, if we can go to paragraph 17 and further, that's where it seems you then are now dealing with the second time that you saw him on the Saturday.
Yeah. So you'll see that. So having now looked at the EEGs and knowing in my own mind that he has epilepsy, I then, in an attempt to start to understand the consistency of his history, I just asked him again about it. So obviously we are, in medicine, we're also careful about consistency of things.
Okay. But then you, in paragraph 18 and 19, it appears that you then asked him about the events as set out in your report. And then if we turn the page, it goes on. Little page, paragraph 22. It seems that deals with the discussion that you had with him on the Saturday. Is that
Yes. I think I stand under correction, but I think I went and saw him twice on the Saturday. I would have to just think carefully about that or consult my notes. But nonetheless, it was. I certainly saw him at least once on the Saturday.
Apart from what was recorded here, did he divulge any further information or additional information about the event, or did you record it fully what he said?
What I've transcribed here is what he told me, and I'm a meticulous note taker. I have, I'm told the biggest, we have an electronic database that I use, a company that does this. I'm told that I have the biggest database in the country because I write down everything that patients say.
Okay. And then in paragraph 22, if you can just quickly read.
Good point,
you go to paragraph 22 and just briefly just refresh your memory there as well.
Paragraph
22.
Yes.
again, to understand you correctly, that it was only after he has again given you all the information that you then only disclosed to him that he has epilepsy.
Correct, yes, indeed. And I think that's when I went back a second time, if I remember correctly, but I stand under correction. But nevertheless, what you say is absolutely correct. Yeah.
Then we get to the specific paragraphs that you were dealt with in paragraph 25 and 26. And again, it would appear from your, please you can confirm that perhaps, that is the third discussion you had with him on the Sunday.
Yes, yes. So having now established what happened on the Wednesday and having established that he had epilepsy, I thought it my business to try and work out what had happened before, given a history of amnesia.
All right. Now, what you have penned down in paragraph 25 and 26, if I understand it correctly, and I'm paraphrasing, but it will appear, and this perhaps you confirm it with reference to your report, you asked him about, and he gave you the information from the moment, like you said, woken up until the what happened that afternoon, interrogation that afternoon.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, you've had access to, which is marked as Exhibit J, my client's plea explanation. Can you recall that period of time was set out in the paragraph, in the plea explanation in a fair amount of detail over a number of pages?
Yes, yes. I can't remember the exact detail of all of that, but I did read it, yes.
What I want to know from you, the information that you gathered from the accused on the Sunday,
yes,
was it in as much detail as the plea explanation?
No.
And is there a reason for that? That you didn't go into that much detail?
Well, I think the issue was, a good question. So I think firstly time constraints. So, you know, if I could have on a Sunday with 10 or 12 people in the ward and spent several hours with him, I gladly would have done so. But pressures of time and family commitments, etc. And the second is that the most important details that I needed in terms of the arriving at a conclusion about what had happened, I'd obtained in my own mind.
Okay. Then if you can go briefly back to paragraph 4.
There was, I mean, just to say, there was one question which struck me, which I had, after I'd compiled this report, which when I reflected upon it, and if there was an omission on my part in terms of questions, there's one that I wished I'd asked before I'd done all of this, and that was to, we often do this if you try and establish things in the past, is specifically ask him. So I'd asked him in a general way about preceding events, but I hadn't specifically asked him whether he'd ever woken up before the night of the murder, with either wetting his bed. I'd asked him about whether similar things had happened before about incontinence, but never specifically said to him, have you ever woken up with unexplained wetting of the bed, or a pain on the side of your tongue, or severe aching of your muscles as though a truck has ridden over you?
Okay, all right. Now, the diagnosis that you made, that you testified about, are juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. When did you, for the first time, tell Mr. Pavement that he had this specific type of epilepsy?
On the Sunday, as I recall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when he was asked to tell you about specific symptoms, that you gave him a list of symptoms, when was that?
Oh, that was on the Friday night.
Did he at that stage have any idea what was wrong with him?
He had not the foggiest idea.
Okay. Now then, with regards to the specific seizure that you saw on the...
Or should I just qualify that? From what I could see, he didn't have the foggiest idea.
Then what you could see from the EEG, that the seizure is a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, as opposed to a focal seizure. When did he get that information?
So, sorry, about
that he experienced a generalized tonic-clonic seizure as opposed to a focal seizure?
Well, I think as I recall, I'll just have to check my notes, but I think I told him on the Saturday that he had had an epileptic seizure on the Wednesday.
Okay. Now, with regards, can you just remind us again of the two types of seizures, the focal seizure as opposed to the generalized tonic-clonic? Which one would cause sudden loss of consciousness?
Generalized tonic-clonic seizure, a grand mal seizure, not the little twitches.
So, but when he told you about that, did he have any idea about the difference between the two? Of his sudden loss of consciousness, in other words?
You mean initially?
Yes.
He again, he didn't know he had epilepsy. And I still at that point was, because of the nature of this court case, was still very circumspect about the possible diagnosis of epilepsy.
Okay. No.
Had the circumstances been different, I almost certainly would have made a diagnosis on that Friday night, a clinical diagnosis of juvenile myoclonic epilepsy.
Okay.
But because of the court case, I still had doubts in my own mind, significant doubts actually.
Okay. Then you were asked about the issue about the length of the seizure and the post-ictal state. The period of unconsciousness, does that span, if somebody has received, has experienced a grand mal seizure for 1 to 3 minutes, and thereafter there's a post-ictal state, does that period of unconsciousness span throughout the two periods?
Yes, unquestionably.
And could that period be as long as 2 hours and 40 minutes, the combined period?
As I've said, and I think I answered your question this morning on a, I explained to you the frequency with which that occurs.
Right.
I won't repeat it.
During your consultation with Mr. Van Breda, did he at any stage ever suggest to you that what had happened to him on the night of the murder, the loss of consciousness, may be attributable to a seizure?
No, not at all.
Your Lordship, David? Would you see my message? That's the question I have, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Will we just need to hand this the exhibit G.
Yes, of course.
One and two. With your leave, Lord, just for the record again, the short clip that we viewed first with the twitch of the thumb, we marked G1, and the length the longer one as G3. Your leave.
The bigger one.
The big one.
Yeah. Not the longer one.
These are then admitted in evidence as G3.
G1 is the one clip, and G2 is the other one. We marked
You marked
the disc like that.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks, I'll admit this in evidence as opposed by counsel. Doctor, just before you go, two aspects.
Yes.
The one instance in February
2016.
2016, Mr. Van Breda was sitting with his girlfriend
Yes.
discussing this case.
Yeah.
You recall that?
Yes, on the pavement, yeah.
On the pavement.
That's what they told me.
Yes. And they were discussing this case.
Yeah, I think that's correct, Your Honour, yeah. I think that's, yeah, I think they said they were stressed, or I think that was correct.
And the second instance, they were on a bed, sitting on a bed,
Yeah,
and they were discussing this case.
yeah.
And they had the seizure then. So, does it follow that they had the seizures because of when discussing this case?
Yes, I think, you know, my initial instinct, as I told you when I got phoned about this, was that psychogenic was perhaps the most likely cause, but the evidence then disproved that hypothesis.
I purely noticed this as coincidence.
Yeah, but
I think both
I think
instances he was discussing this case when he had.
No, I think the relevance is the stress issue. Yeah, I think it's the stress that provoked it.
A case such as this is obvious stress.
Yeah, I would agree.
Now, Doctor, I know medical science has advanced tremendously since the days of Hippocrates. Modern medicine, that is. But the best place or time to make a diagnosis is at the time incident occurs. Is that not so?
Unquestionably, unfortunately, in my field, where I see, as you can see, many people, is that you have to be a careful detective to work this thing out.
Your field is also more an uncertain field because you deal with the vagaries of the human mind.
And unquestionably, yeah.
So the human mind is very unpredictable.
I think the science of that is that there's a huge variation in the way, and like everything else in life, predicting the future. I mean, the famous saying of Yogi Berra.
It's very possible to predict the future.
Yeah.
But in this instance, you're making a diagnosis 3 years after the incident
Yes.
occurred.
Yes, I have to do that a lot of the time. It's
2.5 years.
Yeah, it's my daily job to do this. Yeah.
Yes, no, it would be a
And-
daily
and-
job to do so.
Yeah. Could I?
But doesn't, all I'm asking is this, 2.5 years later, with no position to make a proper differential diagnosis there and then, isn't your task complicated?
It is. I'm in the fortunate position of at least having an independent way of verifying things.
Is that accept that your evidence throughout was
Yeah.
that you sought to find independent markers?
Yeah.
All I'm saying is this, that your diagnosis comes 2.5 years later in the middle of a trial.
Yeah.
Is not so?
I was very
A
mindful
trial
of that,
which
Your Honour.
is highly controversial and
I understand
highly
that.
charged.
I understand it. Yeah.
So it makes your diagnosis, all I'm saying is, difficult.
Your Honour, with due respect, I in coming here felt that I had to
No, I'm not
I came with
accepting-
biases, and I understand the complexities of what you refer to, and I've tried to be particularly circumspect given the situation.
Yes, no, I accept that, Doctor. I accept that you come here. I'm not please challenging your
No,
integrity
no, I
at all,
understand.
Doctor.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
But I'm saying that it's difficult to make a diagnosis in these circumstances.
I understand.
And perhaps others would be less confident than you in coming to conclusion.
I understand, Your Honour. I understand what you're saying.
Thank you, Doctor. Is there any further?
This one has been, the diagnosis of Mr. Bladder suffering from juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. Again, I want to put on record, how certain are you about that?
Is that okay?
To repeat what I said before, as certain as I've ever been of anybody with a particular epilepsy condition.
Thank you.
You said that. I just missed out. You didn't conduct any tests with,
You mean blood tests?
yeah,
No. Sorry?
any tests?
No. Yes, we did. We did the EEGs, and I reviewed the MRI
No,
scan.
but you couldn't do it at the time.
Sorry?
Your tests don't reflect what happened 2.5 years ago.
Oh, you mean in terms of were any blood tests done then?
No. The EEG, what do you call it, shows what happened now. Is there any way of confirming on the EEG what happened 2.5 years ago?
No. You have to, that's why as I've tried to explain this report, you have to, in my field, be a very careful detective in inferring what's happened in the past. So the myoclonus, which was I'm very confident has been there, and the myoclonus is epilepsy. So I'm very confident the
But
epilepsy.
if you have a heart attack, it shows on your heart
Yes,
years later. If you
yes,
had a
sure,
heart attack,
sure.
muscle is not working anymore.
Yeah.
But in this case, if you had a myoclonic attack 2 years ago, there's no way of determining that.
Yeah, I think but there are many conditions in medicine like that, and there are many conditions where the diagnosis is simply based on a history. Like one of the most common conditions that we see in medicine is depression. Right?
And history, as we all know,
History is crucial there.
but history is also very uncertain at times.
History of depression is something which is the way it's dealt with scientifically is and just to give you some idea of the whole issue of
Sorry, I don't mean to take...
but just to make the point, people, I think it's an important point you raise, is that when it comes to where you don't, and there's plenty of this in medicine, of where you don't have objective measures, and there are only degrees of objectivity. So, for instance, if you presented with a particular tumor, and we took a biopsy of that tumor and sent it to the pathologist, and the pathologist says to you, you have melanoma, believe it or not, that isn't a completely certain diagnosis. And we know that because if you take that particular tumor and you give it to 10 pathologists, they don't all come to the same diagnosis. So the way of assessing actually, we call it a gold standard in evidence-based medicine. But sometimes the best way of measuring reliability is what's called inter-rater reliability. So if 10 people see someone who has had a seizure and assess the reliability of that. Or if 10 people see someone who's depressed and they all agree the person's depressed, they're depressed.
Thank you, Doctor. That will conclude Dr. Butler. Sorry?
More questions? After your question,
Yeah.
more questions.
You want to ask a question?
No.
Do you want to follow up? Is there any follow-up questions? No. Ms. Galloway, any follow-up questions? Dr. Butler, thank you very much for coming along.
Pleasure, Your Honour. Yeah.
You may step down.
Thank you.
Yes. Can we just adjourn for about 5 minutes, and then we come back and deal with the further conduct of this matter?
Please.